Welcome to the CompTIA Cybersecurity Analyst Certification mini crash course from Tech Commanders. I'm really excited that you're here to learn more about the CompTIA CySA Exam. The course itself has the following sections. We'll be discussing what a CySA is. We'll talk about the exam objectives. I'll talk about the cybersecurity pathway. I'll provide you the top 10 tips and tricks for preparing for the exam. I'll also talk about analysis methods, security tasks that you want to know, firewalls and proxies, what are the DOD and ISO requirements. We'll also discuss sample practice questions that'll help you decide if you're ready for the exam or not. I'll also provide you additional test tips, and then we'll go ahead and provide resources and close out the course. The course itself will provide you test tips, a presentation download, documentation links, and a free test preparation crib sheet. When it comes to your instructor, let's go ahead and provide a quick introduction. My name is Joseph Holbrook, and I'm the CLO of Tech Commanders here in Jacksonville, Florida. I've been in the IT industry for quite a while, over 20 years, and I've had the opportunity to work on numerous government and commercial sites, everything from military to financial sector organizations. I've also had the opportunity to teach a ton of courses and also write books as well. I'm also a CompTIA subject matter expert for the Cloud Plus exam. Lastly, I'm also a U.S. Navy veteran. By the end of the course, you should be able to understand what exactly are the exam objectives. What are the tips and tricks you want to really understand for this exam? I'll also discuss the differences between the CSO 2 and the O3 exams. At the time of writing this specific course, there's two exam versions out. We have 002 and 003. Now, as far as the exam 003, that'll be available in March of 2023. At the time of writing, we still got months away before that'll be available. When it comes to some other areas we're going to cover, we want to definitely talk about IDSs, firewalls, security tasks, and much more. And I'll also provide you some test tips as well to help you prepare for the exam. As far as some important notes, this is an introductory course. It's not a concise resource. Be aware that the course does not cover every exam objective, nor in deep enough detail either. With that said, there's additional resources I will provide you at the end of the course to help you succeed for the exam. It is important to realize that this course should provide you some good insight into whether or not you want to go ahead and take the exam. When it comes to looking for an additional course, we have a full course which is over 18 hours of video content available on Tech Commanders or our partner sites. This includes demos and whiteboards, practice questions as well. Now, we do also have additional practice questions on Tech Commanders. There's also an ebook I put together that's available on Amazon Kindle. Lastly, check out the Tech Commanders YouTube channel for additional free content. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. What is a CySA? Now, a CySA is a CompTIA Cybersecurity Analyst. Now, this is a workforce certification, and it applies behavioral analytics to networks and devices so that we prevent, detect, and combat any cybersecurity threats through continuous security monitoring. Well, in a nutshell, it's really about validating that you have the skills that are going to mitigate threats. Now, one point here is that you see the CySA Plus. Now, in the world of CompTIA, the plus means that this is a certification that can be renewed. They do expire after so many years, it's 3 years, and you would need to continue taking courses, writing blog posts, writing books, speaking, etc. to maintain your certification. And there's a number of different ways you could do that. That's a little beyond the scope, but just be aware that the plus sign is just saying that you need to take CEUs and you'll need to pay the fee as well to renew it. As far as the CySA Plus, it is about you being able to leverage intelligence and threat detection techniques, really being able to analyze and interpret data, identify and address vulnerabilities, also look at preventative measures, and respond to and recover from any incidents. So this is a mid-level certification, and as noted before, the plus is that it is going to be renewable. The exam itself is multiple choice and performance-based questions, meaning that if you take one question and you do well on it, that the exam will likely respond differently if you don't do well on that question. So just be aware that it is a combination of multiple choice and performance-based. Lastly, the CySA focuses on software, application security, threat intelligence, and regulatory compliance. Let's move on to the next lesson. CySA Exam Objectives. Now, one of the things about CompTIA exams is that they really provide you really detailed exam objectives. Now, an objective is really an area that they're going to test you on. They're declaring ahead of time, here is what you can expect on the exam. Now, as far as the objective areas and how you can expect the objectives to read, this is an example of the areas that you should see the objectives focus on. So what we'd like to do now is go over to the exam objectives and talk more about it. Now, as far as the exam objectives, you could download the PDF from the CompTIA site, or you could also click on the link directly in the resource list to get it as well. That should be part of this course. As far as the exam number, it is listed here, 002, and there's also objectives for 003 as well. Now, be aware that when you take the exam, you may or may not have the exam 002 or 003, depending on, again, when you take the exam. Be aware that the 003 exam was in beta at the time of writing this specific course, and the 003 exam should be available by March of 2023. So if you take the course after that, the information's still good. It's just that, just be aware that you're taking the newer test and not the older test. Now, as far as the exam itself, I'd encourage you, of course, to read all this before you take the exam, but be aware that the exam is going to have these domains. We're going to cover these domains here shortly in more detail. Now, as far as the number of questions, 165 minutes to take. Basically, I think when I took the exam it was like 92 or something like that. Usually these are questions that are used for analytics purposes to see what type of questions, the formats, what work with, what doesn't, right? So just be aware that you'll likely get more questions, and that doesn't mean you're going to get graded on every one or anything. Now, you need a 750 to pass the exam. Now, as far as the objectives, these are the objectives that are listed for the 002 exam. So you want to definitely check each of these in more detail. I won't be going through this specifically in this short course because of time purposes, but just be aware this is how you will find out what exactly you will be tested on. Now, in my long form course, we will cover each of these in detail. Now, one thing to be aware of too, as you see here, right, they've got these broken down into subsections, and they also clarify, for example, areas you want to know for each of these. And what I like about CompTIA is they are very specific. In other words, you know that you will likely get tested when it comes to automation concepts on, for example, the automation protocol called SCAP. You'll likely also need to know SOAR as well. So these are some acronyms that you'll want to know ahead of time. Now, the reason I'm saying acronyms is on the exam, they don't typically spell out what exactly the acronym is. So when you see SOAR or you see SCAP, you'll want to be able to identify what they really mean. Now, with that said, definitely check out the diagram and make sure you go through each of these to understand the domain and the objectives that are in that domain. I'm going to talk about the domains and some of the differences between the two exams here coming up here in the next lesson. In this lesson, let's go ahead and talk about the changes to the exam. Now, we're going to compare 002 to 003. Now, before we proceed, be aware that this is November of 2022 that I am recording this specific course. Now, if you've taken the beta exam, none of this will likely be new to you. If you have not taken the beta exam, this will be new to you. So, if you're going to be taking the CompTIA CySA exam sometime in 2023, you may or may not want to wait to take the 003 exam. I'll leave it up to you to figure that out. However, at the time of writing, only 002 is available. 003, the latest release, will be available according to CompTIA in March of 2023. Now, for those that would like to take the exam that is available now, but that is CSO 002, and let's go ahead and compare now the difference between the exams from a domain perspective. So we're going to go from, on the current exam 002, which will likely be available until March of 2023. Again, don't quote me on that because it could be a little bit earlier, it could be a little bit later, depending on how CompTIA does with the scoring on the beta and actually finalizing all the objectives and questions and all that. So when it comes to preparing for the new exam, there are some very significant changes. The good part, though, is that I would say 80 to 85% of the content is still the same from the previous exam. So don't fret if you take the 002 now or you wait till the 003. The big deal here is that they do add some areas of focus that was not on the previous exam, and I'll talk about those here in a minute. So from a domain perspective, high-level perspective, you could see that they go from 5 specific domains to 4 domains. Now, the weighting of the domains, of course, will increase. So that means that you'll need to get a little bit more, what I would call knowledgeable, or actually basically confident in specific areas like security operations. This is a heavy part of the exam. This definitely increased from basically 002. They also add vulnerability management. Now, that domain is really broken down from the threat and vulnerability management. So there's some areas of focus that were added to the new domain, basically in 003. And I'll talk about what has been updated here in a minute. Incident response. Again, nothing new there. It's just that they've added a little bit wider net into what you're going to be tested on. Now, this is really the newer part of the exam, reporting and communication. There's definitely some newer areas here, but it does sort of fall into monitoring and also some areas around assessment, for example. So just be aware that the domains itself are still pretty much covering the same material. They've just made the area that you're going to be tested on a little bit wider. So let's talk about what is noticeably different. All right. The notice changes that I can point out pretty obviously from my experience with the beta, but also looking at the objectives as well, would be here. Security operations and pen testing is certainly tested heavier. No question about it. Another area that I noticed was they added some new terminology. So abuse, PDP, Joe Sandbox. Okay, so what exactly would those be? Now, Joe Sandbox is really focused on malware analysis. It's really automated. Now, the goal is to detect and analyze malware as well as URLs on, for example, believe Windows, of course, Android, Linux, etc. The goal is to be able to identify issues before they become an issue. And then as far as abuse PDP, this is really an API service that is used for reporting and checking IP addresses. It also can review, for example, webmasters and administrators as well to determine, for example, malicious IPs that are spamming, performing, for example, hack attempts, etc. Now, when it comes to programming, okay, this is probably the biggest change, I think. The reason is on the previous exam, the 002, which is the current version actually now, it's time of writing, and it may or may not be, of course, when you review this course, but be aware that there is going to be a requirement for you to look at programs or scripts, basically a small snapshot of a script, and determine, is it Python, is it JavaScript, but also determine as well, has it been terminated? What is the problem with that specific program? So there is, again, an additional wider net on this exam, and programming can definitely be a new area for some folks in the world of security. Another area that seemed to really pick up was vulnerability analysis. Now, we had that, of course, on the previous exam. It's just that the net is wider here. Also, pen testing. This is another area as well that has been expanded on. You'll need to know, for example, what is Angry IP Scanner. Again, we'll cover all these in deeper detail. Now, as far as new response frameworks, we have MITRE and Diamond. Now, MITRE is really a knowledge base of adversary tactics, techniques. It's like a footprint that has been documented. Now, the attack framework stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge, known as the MITRE Attack Guidelines and Framework. Now, there's 14 tactic categories. I won't cover them here, but in the long form course, rest assured you're going to be an expert in them by the time we're done. And then Diamond is another framework you'll want to get to know. Now, some other changes is that it seemed like, at least from my experience, that you definitely needed a deeper knowledge for scanning, for CVSS scanning. So that's the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, known as CVSS. This is really a method, an approach that is used to qualitatively measure severity of a potential issue, a threat. There's really 3 specific metric groups that are used. We have the base, temporal, and environmental. I won't cover these right now, but one thing that did come up is understanding, for example, the severity and the score range. Again, I'll cover those in more detail in the long-form course. That's all that I had for this lesson. Let's move on. CompTIA, Cybersecurity Pathway. Now, CompTIA has done an excellent job at providing potential test takers, students, folks that are interested in cybersecurity, a pathway. Now, the pathway provides you insight into where you should start and where you may want to end up. Now, this cybersecurity pathway is available on the CompTIA website. The link is right there and also available in the link list that's been provided as part of the course to help you get to that pathway. Now, generally you want to start out with certifications such as the IT Fundamentals, the A+, then move on to Network Plus and Security Plus, and then determine, do you want to go for the CySA or the pen test? Now, is there really a need for you to take both? That's something for you to determine based on your job role or where you want to really end up in your career. And then the final certification would be the CASP. That is the top tier security certification currently with CompTIA. Now, another site that I want to provide you, or actually link on the CompTIA site, is the Career Path Roadmap. Now, what I like about this is that CompTIA has provided you not only an alternate view, but it also allows you to determine, well, you know what? If I'm going to be a cybersecurity specialist, I should probably consider these specific certifications. You could probably skip over IT Fundamentals and A+, and just take Network Plus and Security Plus. And then consider perhaps Project Plus as part of that, and then determine CySA and Pen Test. And then also, too, one thing that you want to be aware of is that there's also the ability for you to obtain partner certifications, such as from Cisco, as part of you completing the CompTIA certifications. Now, that's another discussion in itself, but look into that if that's of interest. There is that collaboration between some partners. Now, one more thing to consider is, again, if you're going to go cybersecurity, here's your path. But then what about if you want to become a support specialist or a network specialist? Again, this lays out where you may want to consider from a certification perspective. That's all that I had for this lesson. Let's move on. Tips and tricks for preparing for this challenging exam. Now, when it comes to preparing for any exam, we want to make sure that we understand what we already know and what we need to learn. We're not going to know everything in most cases, and of course that shouldn't be expected, but what we want to do is certainly to follow up on areas that we're not sure about. We should have a baseline knowledge already around Security Plus and Network Plus. Be aware that a fair amount of content is really coming from these 2 exams. It's just really adding a little higher level of knowledge and a wider level of knowledge as well. So if you have passed both of those exams, you should really be in good shape, certainly to prepare efficiently for taking the CySA. It would be highly advisable that you have some hands-on experience around IDSs, SIEMs, CVSSs, other security tools, to go without saying. Now, I'm going to go through some of the security tools that you'll want to be aware of for this exam. And again, not an exclusive list we're going to go through in the tips and tricks here, but just be aware that I'm just giving you some areas to point out and see how you do on it. Always consider practice questions. Take lots of those practice questions and always improve. This exam is one of the exams that was really meant to address cybersecurity and also allow someone in the military to also go into a role in the federal government and to have that baseline knowledge. Now, this is only a small section of the exam, so not really a lot there to memorize. There might be 5 or 6 questions that might come up in this area, but I did want to point this out to folks that may not be familiar with some of the legislation, some of the frameworks that are out there. Okay, the first one is understand what the NIST framework is. Now, the NIST framework is really security controls that are going to be implemented in federal information systems. So the U.S. government does use NIST frameworks as part of other frameworks that are implemented, such as FedRAMP. So look into this, make sure you understand what the NIST framework is. This is the 853A. The second tip to know is around FIPS 200. So FIPS 200 is addressing what is referred to as the minimum security requirements for federal information and information systems. This is known as Pub 200. Now, you want to look into this because, again, this is a requirement, especially for anyone that is looking into deploying, for example, in a federal government environment, information systems, and to look at things from a risk-based perspective. And again, we'll go into that in a long-form course. Another thing to be aware of is FISMA. So FISMA is the Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002. This is a law that was put in place as part of the Modernization Act of 2014. All right, now as far as tools, the first tool we want to talk about is SNORT. Now, SNORT, the fourth tip is to learn SNORT, to understand what SNORT is, how it works. SNORT is a packet sniffer that monitors network traffic. It's going to look at the packets and determine what is a dangerous payload, what is suspicious, and it's really perhaps the main enterprise tool that's out there in the world of security, especially around, for example, looking at network intrusions, detection, prevention systems. So we consider this more of an IDS and IPS as well. It is open source, and it does provide real-time traffic analysis, etc. I won't cover, of course, deep details into this. We will cover this in the long-form course. Number 5, Wireshark. Okay, so Wireshark is another tool that you'll want to learn. This specific tool, Wireshark, is a network protocol analyzer, and it's meant to capture packets from a network connection, and this could be, for example, from your home computer, your home network, or the office. The goal is to really look at what is going on at a deeper level, to look at the packets, and again determine, is this an issue, is this not? It is meant to look at very discrete units of data in an Ethernet network. The next tool that we want to talk about is called SolarWinds. Now, SolarWinds is really a software company, and this company has different management tools for network and infrastructure monitoring, and they also provide the main tool that seems to be the most widely used when it comes to SolarWinds products. It would be called Orion. So definitely look at SolarWinds and understand that this is a tool we could use to monitor our network, for example. Now, for tip number 7, what is Splunk? Now, Splunk is an SIEM tool, and this is a tool, and it's referred to as a service as well, that is going to enable your security team, your network team, to respond to any potential threats that it picks up. The goal is to look at the data, to look at all the different touch points that are occurring in your network, the data that is basically being brought in. The goal of Splunk is to be able to provide your organization a robust security operations and evaluation tool that is going to analyze risk. Now, when it comes to Splunk, there's different versions of it. We have Splunk Enterprise, for example. It's going to provide, for example, adaptive response. It's going to provide better visibility. It does use machine learning as well to help look at behavior patterns, anomalies, etc. So definitely check out Splunk. Now, Nagios is another tool you want to be aware of. This is a solution that is open source. It's meant to provide, again, a solid monitoring solution, especially for devices running Linux, Windows as well. And the goal is to run checks and look at parameters that you want to set up and monitor. Now, it also has a logging server, a network analyzer as well, and it's really a solution of different services. The next one is Zeek. Now, this was formerly called Bro. Now, Bro is really the industry-leading platform for network security monitoring. It is open source, and it was formerly called Bro for those that are, of course, familiar with it. And it's been around for decades. But with that said, be aware of Bro, now known as Zeek. Nmap is a very common tool. It's been around since the late 90s. And if you're in IT security, you've probably used it a number of times. A lot of cool features with Nmap. The ability to determine everything from what ports are open to also understanding, for example, the type of devices that it might be running on. To look at vulnerabilities, you determine, for example, the OS version. You could also, for example, to use the scripting engine that's part of Nmap as well to also look at potential there. Now, the interface to Nmap is called ZenMap, and again, that's another thing you'll want to be aware of on the exam. So those are the main tips that I wanted to provide for this short course. I would certainly encourage you to take the long-form course. That way you'll be well prepared for the exam. Let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. When it comes to comparing analysis methods, it's so important that we understand IDSs and IPSs. But not only that, we need to understand the options available for IDSs and IPSs, but also the methods that are used to determine a threat as well. Now, Snort is, of course, widely known and widely used, and there's different versions of it, such as some vendors have their own take on it, like Cisco SourceFire. We could also look at using security monitors like Zeek, and we could also use regular expressions as well called regex. And these are just some of the options out there. Now, we want to be aware that when it comes to types of IDSs, we have signature-based, behavior-based, and anomaly-based. So we need to be aware that if it's signature-based, it's generally going to be only as good as the last update. In other words, it's looking for a very specific hash pattern in a lot of cases, at least from how they're implemented most of the time. So, for example, it's going to look for what is called a signature. And that specific hash is going to be very specific, and we're going to know that that's the most recent version because of that signature. The problem is that it can be malformed through any number of methods, and we could also, again, use encryption as a way to evade detection. So if we're using certain types of encryption, this may not be the best option. So because of that, we want to be aware that signatures do not identify every tool available to adversaries. Then we have behavior-based detection as well. This is a little bit more comprehensive, but the downside to this type of detection is that it can have a lot of false positives. And then there's another option for analysis called anomaly-based detection. Anomalies are basically looking for patterns. If something's out of the pattern, it'll then alert you as well. So that's really all that I had for this brief discussion about detections in IDSs and IPSs. Let's move on. Common security tasks to know. One of the areas that you'll run into on this exam is to really understand what would be some of the tasks that you'll be performing on a day-to-day basis as a CySA or a cybersecurity professional. That can be anything from setting up security policies such as an acceptable use policy, data policy, privacy policies, etc. It could be monitoring traffic. Performing log analysis is another important job requirement. Managing audit trails and audit policies. We may have to implement them as well. Data loss prevention is another area. Patch management. That can be running, for example, baselines or configuring baselines, running CVSS. Whatever that is going to entail, we're going to need to maintain our configurations. Security awareness. We may also need to promote security internally and also train other people as well. When it comes to mobile device management, this is an area that we absolutely need to know. We need to know in a lot of scenarios, for example, what is BYOD, bring your own device? What are some of the best practices around that? We'll need to look at technical and non-technical controls when it comes to data privacy. Data loss prevention is really important, as well as performing vulnerability assessments. And this really comes down to identifying the tools as well. So we'll really need to know what are the options for vulnerability assessments and what tools go along with them in the enterprise. Now, some other areas that are not listed here could very well be developing documentation, could also be running, for example, with specific vendors, pen tests, as well. This is really true, especially in the newer exam, the 003 version. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Firewalls and proxies. Perhaps one of the main areas that can confuse anyone a little bit new to cybersecurity is really understanding firewalls and proxies. So I wanted to talk about the specific types of security tools that can be software or hardware depending on how we implement them. With that said, a firewall is a network security device that helps protect users' networks by filtering traffic and blocking malicious content. Now, firewalls typically have rule sets that you can effectively put into place to mitigate traffic going in and out of your network. Generally, there's also implied rules as well that you want to be aware of. Now, these can be hardware or software based as well. And when it comes to firewall configurations, be aware that we could deploy these not just at the edge network, but also, for example, on a LAN segment, on a host, or it could be application as well. Now, rule sets we'll need to configure. Tuples is another term that we would use. And then we could also have, for example, an implicit deny rule where we would drop any traffic that effectively is not allowed. In other words, it's going to drop it. There's no ands, ifs, or buts, right? So just be aware that these are some of the terms you're going to run into in the world of not only CySA, but also Security Plus if you haven't taken that. Now, firewalking is another tool. Okay. Now, firewalking is a term you want to be aware of as well. Now, this term called firewalking is a term you want to know. This is an approach that is really an active reconnaissance tool that you could use that will attempt to determine what layer is going to be allowed, what protocols would be allowed for that matter, through a specific firewall. So typically it's layer 4. Again, okay, do that again. Now another term we want to be aware of is firewalk or firewalking. So firewalking is a technique that's used to perform an active approach to reconnaissance for network security. And this is going to attempt to determine what layer 4 protocols are actually allowed through the firewall. And this is a term, again, you really need to know what it is. So when it comes to firewalls, there's really 2 classes of firewalls. We have the packet filter firewall, and we have a proxy-based firewall as well. So first, a packet filter firewall is usually a type of screen router or a filter. The goal is that it'll forward and block packets based on information in the network layer, such as layer 4, and also it'll look at the transport layer as well, I should say. And that'll look at some of the common headers. That could be the source, where it's coming from and where it's going, the destination. Could be the IP address range. Could be the source, the destination port, and also the protocol that's being used as well. Now, the next type of firewall is a proxy-based firewall known as an application gateway. Now, this type of firewall is going to look deeper into the traffic, in other words, the message, for example, or the application protocol that's being used. So it's application level traffic, and determine, for example, if this specific type of traffic is actually going to be acceptable or not. Now, an example would be Fortinet, FortiProxy. So when we configure a firewall, there's usually a process we want to go through, and we want to know from a high-level perspective what has to be done in what order. So when we configure a firewall, we first need to install it. We're then going to configure the firewall, like set up the parameters, the rule sets, and then we're going to put together our zones, configure any IPs we need. We need to have an ACL or ACLs for that matter. We need to also look at other services that we might want to put in place. We want to test out our configs and then monitor our traffic after that. When it comes to types of firewalls, again, we could look at different approaches that could be used. So packet filtering, of course, is going to be the more common approach, especially when it comes to like a host-based, for example, or maybe an edge as well. It all depends on the type of network and how old it is. In reality, a lot of networks now use, for example, what's called an NGFW. This is a next generation firewall. When it comes to firewall protocols, these are just some of the common protocols that you want to be aware of. Now, also, too, not listed here is you'll want to know specific ports. For example, understand what port 21 is, understand as well what is the port for SNMTP, SNMP, Telnet. When it comes to incoming and outgoing logging, so it goes without saying, we need to log pretty much everything that we can within reason. We're not going to probably log everything 100% of the time and then keep it forever, right? So we need to really understand what we need to really log. So we could be looking at everything from events that occur to storage capacity to traffic that might be denied incoming into our network, traffic that was accepted, going in and out of the network. It could be traffic going out that was denied, right? It could be just about any other number of different areas we log. And also, too, we could look at events as well, like debug, informational, any other notifications. When it comes to incoming and outgoing login review, we want to really filter everything so that we can really look at things and get notified as easy as possible. Now, as far as some of the vendors for firewalls, there's any number of vendors that we could look at. Cisco has a number of different options, of course. Juniper, all the vendors typically have their own OEM version of a firewall in a lot of cases, like IBM, HPE, Dell. Not to mention Palo Alto, which is known for their NGFWs, Barracuda, really marketed towards that small and mid-sized business, Fortinet, more enterprise. So we want to at least get an idea of some of the vendors as well. Okay, now proxy. So there's a lot of confusion out there between a firewall and a proxy. Are they the same? Are they really different? What is really the take on this? We need to be very cognizant of proxies and firewalls. This will confuse you on the exam if you're not 100% sure you're confident in this area. A proxy server, now also be aware too that there's different types of proxies. So because of that, we have a proxy server and a proxy firewall. This is confusing as well, and sometimes you'll need to stop and think, okay, this is what I should implement, not that, right? It's about understanding the difference. So a proxy server is basically a bridge on the internet that you can or may not, depending on how you configure things, connect directly to websites. So for example, this is outgoing traffic typically that your user base might use to get to a website. A proxy firewall is a little different, where this is really more of a system that's put in place to filter at the application layer. So this could be an application firewall or a gateway firewall as well. To sum it up, a proxy firewall is commonly a proxy server, but not all proxy servers are proxy firewalls. Again, this is one of those types of scenarios you might get on the exam where you need to determine what is really being implemented or what do you really need to implement. Now, there's different proxy types as well. There's outbound and inbound. So make sure you're aware of the difference between those. At a high level, it's pretty obvious. But at a lower level, there might be some confusion there that you want to clear up before the exam. With that said, let's move on. DOD and ISO. Now, DOD being Department of Defense and ISO being the International Standards Organization. Now, your organization that you're in now may require you to get a specific level of certification. You'll need to understand what you need to actually attain in your situation. Now, the DOD 8570 is meant for what is really the Department of Defense. That could also, and actually does, entail contractors to DOD, but it's also accepted as well in a lot of other government agencies. So you'll need to really understand what is the IAT level, for example, you may need to attain in your organization. Now, as far as the CySA, this baseline certification is considered an IAT level 2. And again, if you're going to administer, for example, specific systems, or you're going to manage systems, you'll need to understand what level your organization is going to require you to attain. Now, ISO IEC 17024 is a framework for certification bodies that are operating a program that is going to accredit them. And this is a standard that will determine education, knowledge, etc. And once again, you'll need to understand if you'll need to attend to this or not in your organization. Now, chances are, if your company subscribes to ISO, this could come up as a requirement to get certified in whatever program that your company, organization, business unit even, might require. With that said, let's move on to the next lesson. Sample practice questions. Now, let's go through a fair number of questions here to test your knowledge. Now, to make you aware, we really didn't cover any of these subjects. The goal was to give you some practice questions that we didn't actually cover in this very short review so that you can understand where else you need to go in your specific journey to the CySA certification. So let's go ahead and test our knowledge and see how we will do. What type of an assessment is performed by an assessor using a static analysis tool? And if you need more time, feel free to hit the pause button. The answer would be C, a code review. The explanations are here in the slide. I'll let you review that. If you have any questions, I will just continue with the rest of the review questions. All right, attack trees show which of the following? The correct answers would be A and B. Remember, the goal of the attack, the type of attacks that could occur, but it could also be techniques and also the controls as well. So be aware of an attack tree. Which of the following answers would be benefits of designing security early in the development lifecycle? This one here would be select 3. That would be A, B, and D. Remember, with the software development lifecycle, it's always best to develop security into your development processes early on in the cycle. We don't want to put security as a priority in our lifecycle pretty much when we deploy it, right? It's all about understanding what is really the best approach to designing security. Next question. Which of the following would be important considerations for security architecture? We want to select 2 here, A and C. So we should always understand where and when to apply controls. For example, at the edge, when someone's trying to log into the network, or can we also consider like the host, or would we also consider the application layer, right? It's all about understanding what, where, when, etc. Now, C, meaning that we should be able to reproduce this architecture as needed in our environment. In other words, we want a template. We want to standardize. Next question. Security errors are due to insecure coding and design defects. Which of the following would be considered identifiable during a code review or pen test exercise? So if we're performing a code review or a pen test, we would probably be looking at bugs. So these are defects that can be identified typically in a code review and a pen test. Next question. We're looking for the type of assessment when it comes to assessing risk based on numbers. That would be, of course, quantitative. Now, qualitative would be different. And from a risk perspective, we don't really have expert or quotient, not in the world of IT security, that is. Next one, NIST. When it comes to NIST, they have very specific documentation, best practices around handling an incident. You'll want to really look at the documentation so that you could really place all this in order. Next question. Which approach is used for identifying the underlying causes of an incident? So that would easily be root cause analysis, right? This is how we're going to determine what is causing what issue. Another question. You have been tasked with OS hardening for your on-prem environment. Which of the following should you perform to harden the OS? All right, so we have an operating system, could be Linux, could be Windows. We want to make sure that, let's say, in this case, we have Linux. So if we have Linux, we're going to need to lock down, of course, everything from our directories to the permissions to our UIDs, etc. We need to also look at not only the directory structure, but also the kernel and just a number of other things, right? For this question here, the answers would be B and C. So strong password policies, multi-factor authentication would make sense. So when it comes to this question here, we'd be looking at B and C. So strong passwords, of course, go without saying, and then multi-factor authentication is also important. Now, we shouldn't be just enforcing firewall rules for internal resources only. We should also consider external. So that would be not really a great answer because it's missing external. Now, we should, of course, remove unnecessary software, but not necessary. The last one, we don't want to remove, for example, the SUID. We might want to remove the UID and vice versa, but we need to have a way to change mod and all that. So the way this was worded was not good, so we could skip over that. Another question, which of the following answers would be considered an injection vulnerability? This would be known as a flaw as well. That would be C and D. So that would be cross-site scripting and unsafe deserialization. Another question, which of the following would be true regarding security misconfiguration? The best answers would be B and C. When it comes to security misconfiguration, we want to be aware that if we're not actually configuring things the first time, that could be a problem. If we don't have the right permission set, that's an issue. Now, it would be, of course, true as well that if we don't configure things properly, then we could be hacked and then we could lose, for example, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the application, right? We don't want a data breach. Next question. Which type of an attack could create or control requests from a vulnerable server and be used to target internal systems that are inaccessible from the external network due to the use of a firewall? All right, so this case here would really be focused on C. So a server-side request forgery, an SSRF type of vulnerability, would be where an actor manipulates parameters to create what is really a request from a vulnerable server. And this can result in like a lateral move or a vertical move as well, horizontal, depending on, generally, if they're in the network, again, that's more going down the network, across the network, right? It's about understanding, again, what could occur. Then as far as another question, we have NIST. NIST defines 3 specific classes of security controls. What are they? Easy enough, right? B, C, and D. So definitely look at the SP800 docs. Again, expect to see a few of these NIST-related questions on the exam. Let's move on to the next lesson. Test tips. Now, if you're considering taking a longer form course, you're going to have quite a bit of test tips in our course with Tech Commanders. Now, just to give you a sample of some of the test tips that should help you as well in preparation for the exam, In this case, kill chain. Be aware what a kill chain is. Know the flow as well. Know the functions in Nmap. Be aware, too, of social reconnaissance. What is Google hacking? Know the security controls. Now, these are defined by CompTIA and also NIST as well. We also want to understand that we could define the security controls in terms of their functions. Are they preventative, detective, deterring, right? If we have a security guard, what type of control would that be? If we have a firewall, what type of control would that be, right? Be aware you need to understand how to identify the controls. Okay, a course of action. Now, here's a term you'll want to know. This is a matrix that maps controls that are available to adversary tools and tactics. Think of it almost as like a table you'll put together. Could be a mind map. This is another way to look at it. Fuzzers. We want to know the types of fuzzers. We have application, protocol, and file format. Now, this one here might be something if you're a developer or have experience building programs. This will be a fairly easy one for you. So if we're going to want to look at programming languages, the source code, and try to reverse engineer it, that would be decompiler. So remember, compiler is when we put things together. Decompiler is when we do what? We take it apart. Firewalking. Okay, so we did talk about this term, and this is a way to probe, for example, configuration, what the firewall might allow through, for example, the ports that are open. What about NID systems? So, for example, what would be two widely used one? That would be Snort and Bro. And then sysinternals. When would we want to use sysinternals? So this is for Windows. And again, you want to remember it's for Windows, not for Linux. And just be aware of why you want to use it and what it can do. Let's move on to the next lesson. Additional resources and course closeout. Now, before we close out, be aware that there's a ton of great resources out there. Certainly check out techcommanders.com, thegcpgurus.com, our GitHub as well, and also our content partners. On techcommanders.com, we have a wealth of security courses. Please check out those courses, whether it is in AWS, Google, or CompTIA, or ISC. We probably have a course for you as well as practice questions. Lastly, we have a program called Cloud Interview Ace. So if you are preparing for a cloud career, or you're in IT security now and want to focus on cloud security, let's say, this would be a really good opportunity for you to be able to get some help with preparing for a cloud career. With that said, I just wanted to thank you for joining the course. I do encourage you to consider the long-form course available on Tech Commanders, and definitely reach out if I can be of assistance. Have a great day.